So the boss was in his fortified position, and we find out just how well fortified it was here. He had he had the explosion. He had the whole sand ditch where he had a whole series set up with landmines. And because there were so many of them, when one went, they all went all at once. So the first bunch of knights were coming towards him, charging through, and they hit this wall of explosion. And it just threw up this huge amount of dirt and left a big, long, deep trench all the way across with piles of dirt 25 feet high on each side. Now, Mark Twain was probably inspired by the Battle of the Crater, which took place in Petersburg during the Civil War, where you had General Burnsides going up against General Lee. Now, General Burnsides is probably best remembered because he had these sideburns. He had these huge mutton chops. So he didn't have a mustache. He didn't have a beard. He had just facial hair at the side of his face. He had these big sideburns. And they were referred to as sideburns because he was Burnsides and he had these glorious ones. I mean, this is like king level facial hair. So he had these massive mutton chop sideburns. And so because he was Burnsides, they called them sideburns. Ha ha ha. There are other words that are named after other Civil War generals that maybe we'll talk about later. But sideburns, Burnsides. Anyway, Lee was in Petersburg. And as I said before, the Civil War started out a whole bunch of things like trench warfare and siege warfare. And it took it to a level because this was the first time there were like good gunpowder weapons. Gunpowder weapons had been around for 900 years at this point. They started out during the Crusades. So, I mean, you have almost 1,000 years of experience with firearms at the point of the Civil War. But this is the first time they got good. Because the first few centuries, actually, of gunpowder firearms, yeah, you had them, and yeah, they were kind of cool. But, an archer would put 20 arrows in you. A crossbowman would put 5 or 6 quarrels in you. You would be dead before you could get off a shot. And the accuracy was terrible. But it made a thunderous noise. And it got through armor. But it was just like terrible. Up until about the 1700s, it started getting better. But in the 1800s, they had quick loading rifles, where it wasn't like 20 seconds to load the rifle. And 20 seconds was good. Usually it was like 30 seconds to load a rifle. 20 seconds to load a rifle was pretty good. The Prussians got it down to like 12, which was just like insane. But anyway, so this was the first time you didn't have to wait 20 seconds to load a rifle. They had breech loading rifles. They had semi-automatic rifles. They had breech loading rifles. They had semi-automatic rifles. They had, all this stuff. And the boss has all of this stuff. But anyway, the Battle of Petersburg. So you had the South lined up inside of Petersburg. And Lee and his army were hiding out in Petersburg. And because it's on the sea, they were able to keep resupplied fairly well. And they did have a perfect thing. But the Union couldn't march in an army and take them. And you don't really want to fight in cities. Fighting in cities is just bad. Never have a war in a city if you can avoid it. It just doesn't work out. Sun Tzu said that's the last thing you do. Sun Tzu was almost to the point of turn around and go home before you invade a city. Because if you fight in cities, it's block to block. It's just terrible. Anyway, so they had these ramparts around the city. And Burnside is like, this sucks. We can't charge over them because we get shot down anytime we try. Lee has cannons pointed down at us with grape shot and canister and all of these other things. It's just like, okay, so we can't go over them. We can't go around them because he built them around the city. So he was like, hey, I have some Pennsylvania coal miners here. So hey, coal miners, you know how to dig. I'm like, yeah, we know how to dig. So they started digging. And they dug a tunnel. And this was a cool tunnel. You know, it was all reinforced. And they even had this really cool thing in the tunnel where they had a sort of tube of burlap that ran all along the top. And then at the front end of the tunnel, they had a small fire. And the small fire was raised up a little bit. And what that did was the fire had the warm smoke and it went up through the tube of burlap. And because the smoke was rising through this tube, it did what's called the chimney effect. And what happens is when air rises in a confined space, it builds up inertia. So the faster it goes, the more it goes, the more it pulls. And so this little fire up at the front was sending all of this smoke all the way 200 feet back through the tunnel, 300 feet back through the tunnel. And it was just pulling the air. So the miners at the front got fresh air because as it was pulling the air out through the burlap tube, fresh air was then being sucked in through the back of the mine. So they had this continuous flow of air through the mine. And all they had to do was keep the burlap there separate and a little fire burning to force the air out the top. So the tunnel moved under and then moved under and moved under. And finally they were underneath the big earthworks that surrounded Petersburg. And it's like, yeah, this is going to work. So they loaded it up with gunpowder. They loaded the front of the thing up with gunpowder. And they set a match and they ran away. And it exploded. Huge, huge crater. A couple 100 feet long, hundreds of wide, big, huge crater. Earthworks gone. Big open thing. And then he made his mistake. He just kind of sat there and looked at it. It was like, what did I do? And then allowed the South to go, what did he do? And they got men and they reinforced the people who had been blown up when the crater formed. And then the Union charged through the crater. But the problem was that because it's a blast crater, the sides were kind of steep. And because the South had 2 hours to reinforce themselves, and they lost the moment of surprise, when they ran down through the crater, the South was shooting down at them, and it was a brilliant idea. It was just not quite executed. It failed at the last step of the execution. So Mark Twain probably knew about this when he wrote it. Oh, he certainly knew about this when he wrote that. So anyway, big crater, big explosion, and the Knights back off. Which, you know, makes sense. And then the Knights started sending cows up. Because, you know, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And so they started sending cows up with the idea of, hey, we can lose a few cows. Cows are cheaper than people. Which was kind of a strategy that picked up dreadfully in World War II. Where it wasn't cows are cheaper than people, it's prisoners are cheaper than soldiers. And so the Russians and the Germans both did this. They sent captured prisoners across the lines to find the mines the hard way. Or I guess that's the easy way of finding the mine. But so they sent the cows. Nothing happened. So they're like, okay, we're going to sneak up. And they come up in the middle of a dark, moonless night. And so the boss only has the inner wires done. And when I was reading this, I was like, when is he going to turn on the water? He has the water. He can just flood the thing, drown them all. But he was doing that. He was saving the water for blocking the escape. Which, yeah. When you're going to shut somebody down completely, you have to cut off the escape, which is something I never think of, which is one of the reasons I'm terrible at chess. I'm no good at chess because I can't remember all of the ways to keep someone from moving. So it's like squeezing jello, squeezing sand. What's the squeezing water? It's like trying to grab a fistful of water. It just doesn't work because the water just keeps flowing. Anyway, I can't remember what the metaphor is right now, but any of them apply because I can't remember how to do that. And so what happens is I start pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing because I'm not too bad at taking apart pieces, but I can't manage to get the position and back people into a quarter so I can checkmate them. It's just like the king keeps bopping around. It's like, I can't do this. But, yeah, so I'm not good at chess. And, I would have failed here too. So anyway, the boss leaves the moat, and they come across. And he lets them get way, way in. It's only the last 2 lines, but he only needed the next to last line. So he starts electrocuting them, and he starts moving the electrocutions up. And then once he has the whole field electrified, he turns on the lights. And just like Burnside did, he didn't push the advantage. So if the knights had realized, oh my goodness, we're trapped, and charged, if they would have charged, then they would have ended up knocking down, taking out the wires. And 25,000 of them, a Gatling gun cannot fire that fast. Some of them would have covered the ground. And some of them would have made it. And then once one of the knights is behind the reach of the Gatling guns, everybody inside is gone, because the knight is a guy in armor with a sword doing stuff that a guy with a knight in armor with a sword is good at and trained for. And so the moment 1 or 2 knights got through, it would have been over. But because they weren't expecting the lights, because they just froze and panicked, the Gatling guns to fire up. And once the Gatling guns started firing, they panicked again. And panic is bad. And so they panicked, and they started running backwards towards the trench. At which point the boss flooded the trench. And so big heavy guys in armor can't swim well. So they all went in, and they all pretty much drowned. And the boss is like, this is the end of the story. This is where I'm going to stop telling it. Wow.